Okay, hello everybody. Great to see everyone here today, and some new faces as well. It's fantastic. So today, myself and Prem are going to be giving a bit of a double act. Me starting, Prem coming in later, adding a little bit of extra expertise in terms of his experiences of running a flipped classroom this year. But I just wanted to start by kind of giving a bit of background into what is a flipped classroom, some of the pros and the cons, and some other wider case study examples. And then once Prem's spoken, what we'll aim to do is have a little bit of a group activity and a broader discussion following that. So, for those of you who aren't aware of what a flipped classroom is, I'm sure many of you have come across this concept quite a lot. It really is just a sense of transforming this face-to-face presentation that we traditionally give in a big lecture to lots of students, and changing it so that a lot of that that learning and that sort of directed learning can be made available earlier. So the students are given primers, they're given activities to do to think around the subject area before they get into the face-to-face time with the expert, and then during that session you have the opportunity to have lots of discussions, lots of feedback and activities. So the benefit to the student is potentially to be more engaged and for the experience to be far more personalised. I thought it might be better to get somebody else to give a more expert view of what a flipped classroom it is. And this is a nice short little video, which I hope will work, which just highlights how one person has taken this forward, but gives a lot of background into what the concept of flipped classroom is. And it's a maths teacher from the US. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of how one person has done it, and perhaps their class sizes are rather smaller than some of ours, but the principle is the same. What she's talking about is changing the amount of content that we're giving to students in the lecture time, preloading that, expecting them to work through that and then come to the class and then be able to give more personalised time to the students. So one sense of what the model is like this, the sort of the what, so what, now what idea, which again many of you will be familiar with. And it may start here with the lecturer, the teacher, in which there will be some kind of trigger activity or stimuli to get the students to learn something. And it may be a video of a lecture or a part of the lecture, or some content to be given, or some kind of newspaper article, just to steer their learning, steer their thinking. And that would lead into the students here making their own meaning out of it. So starting to reflect upon it, review it, start to work through some questions maybe in the tests, but also discuss it with each other, and starting to sort of get some idea about what it is that this content means to them. And up in the top quadrant, it says learner generated, but I think this is probably where we'd be coming back into the classroom, and maybe the students themselves would be presenting some of the material, or the instructor would be guiding discussions, leading them through exercise, and starting to allow them to explore the topic, but also test their understanding of what they've learnt through this. And then ultimately what we want through our learning is for them to be able to apply it in a more meaningful manner. And we all are in a sort of applied disciplines here, and we need to make sure that what they are learning in the classroom is going to be applied and understood and contextualised in a wider area. And naturally what we want is to take our lectures through from the lower levels of this Bloom's taxonomy through to higher ones, and it's difficult doing that in a big lecture. And the concept really is that we can use the time in the lecture to start to move further on upwards in this taxonomy, and to encourage them to start to think and analyse much deeper. So what it's not, it really isn't an excuse just to kind of record everything, put it up and say, right, I'll be in my room if you need any questions, if you need any answers to anything, or you've got any problems, come and see me. It's not an excuse just to offload all of that work and just say, well, we've flipped it by just getting rid of it in effect. Because it doesn't answer any of the students' needs, it really just replaces the staff's time. What we really do want to do is start to increase this contact time. And okay, it is hard when you've got 400 students, but still being able to discuss in different ways to different people is far better than just being able to just didactically talk to a whole range of people. Really, we want to be able to allow them to take greater responsibility, and this comes through in aspects I'll discuss slightly later. But it's important for us to make sure that we are not just giving our teaching to them and expecting them to absorb it and then go away to the next lecture. They need to be taking responsibility. This is one method to do that. Similarly, this idea of sage on the stage, guide on the side, we'd all like to think we are the guide on the side, I'm sure. But inevitably, the lecture just puts us right in that centre stage, and they rely upon us to be in that position. The more we can encourage them to expect us just to be that guide on the side, the better. And then there's other reasons, obviously, in terms of blending, but also supporting students who can't be there. So when might we be thinking about flipping the classroom? When the content is challenging, it's an obvious starting point. And this would be, we've all come across areas where the students are struggling, and you change the teaching subtly because the exam results haven't been quite so good on those questions. And this method gives you an opportunity to displace that method that you've used in the past. You've tried to describe it in all sorts of ways, maybe even use the clickers, but to try and encourage them to learn things in a bit more depth before they get in, and then start to discuss things with them and have the activities or the practicals there and then, or get them to present. Also, when you want greater student differentiation, such as if there's sort of moral or ethical issues that you might want them to reflect upon more deeply before they come back in, issues of sort of euthanasia or something, you can teach them the concepts and the theories and some case studies, but what does it mean to them, and how do they really want to, well, how are they going to absorb it and contextualise it in their own sense of where they are and what they want and what their principles are. And similarly, in terms of increasing interaction, and for subject matter that's highly interactive, such as we teach sort of body systems, and there's so much we can do by just being there and presenting things. We've seen it through anatomy and other sort of body systems like respiration, where you can actually have those interactive practicals there and then in front of the students. I wanted to highlight this really because flipped classroom is not just about students, and it's not just about staff. It's actually, there's both. There's benefits on both sides. Obviously different learning styles, learning paces, which can be met by this. So it's not just about students who can write down as fast as they possibly can and memorise facts. It allows students who want to explore the concepts in different ways and do it in a more kinesthetic way or more visual way. But also for the teachers, there are benefits, obviously in terms of kind of less time on classroom management and being able to provide more group assistance, but I think it's also being able to be in touch with your students more effectively and be able to connect and provide this sort of collaborative kind of network for your students in a more sort of structured way. Okay. One person's perspective is very useful. This person's John Sowash, who's been doing flipped classrooms for several years, and he's produced a YouTube summary of his work. These are just 5 of the things that he says that in reflection, this is things that you need to take forward. One, like anything else, it's not a time saver. It actually will take you more time in the first instance, and Prem can probably talk a little bit about that. Using other people's stuff, this is not about, don't worry, it's not about just ripping off other people's work, but there is a huge amount of material out there, and I'll show you one example in a second. So don't expect to have to do it all yourself. Expect resistance from students. This is more challenging. This is kind of moving into that PBL realm that perhaps they didn't choose to come to this medical school because of other medical schools which offer PBL, and so you're putting them into a position where they could be expected to say something in front of 300 or 400 people and do things and challenge them to work outside of the lecture theatres and when it's not on a summative assignment. Keep your options open. Not everything needs to be flipped. There will be topics that you might want to just pick out, the ones in your module that are particularly relevant and might work, and then build up on that if it goes well. And this last one I think is particularly critical, that you can't be engaging with this thinking that, okay, well I'm not teaching now, so actually I've got an hour free and I don't need to think much, I'll have a bit of a Q&A and that should be enough. what you would need to be doing is thinking of this time very, very carefully. Try to structure it, try to include things that will be useful to the students and give them the opportunity to talk and to move around maybe and talk to you as well as each other. Obvious issues that come up, and this perhaps we can be discussing later. Staff who like to engage with the students during the lecture, when they're teaching, they think that's a very good style, and I think that's still to be valued and not to be dismissed at all. But this potential will give you more time to do that kind of interaction by not having to go through slide after slide of your presentation. Do students come to the class? There can be issues with that, and again, Prem may allude to it later. But I think it comes down to this idea of lecture capture and everything else. If you make it important to their learning and you make sure you explain the ground rules clearly to them, then similar to watching the podcasts, you've got to make it important to them and make it relevant. What's the overhead? There is overhead. You need to prepare the materials that they're going to see beforehand. You need to prepare some time to actually maybe engage with them before the lecture if they've got any questions. And then also plan what you're going to do actually in the session itself, and maybe as a follow-up. Maybe it doesn't fit your style of teaching, in which case, as we've seen, there are huge benefits from a student perspective. So maybe there's things that you might want to try just to kind of make it fit into a style that's going to help the students get more feedback from you and more engagement and understand those critical issues. And how does it work for a large class? Well, I think it can work extremely well, and it can only be better than a large lecture where they're just sitting there very passively trying to absorb everything. You can still work in twos, you can still work in small groups, and encourage them to present as well. A couple of just very quick examples. The first one was about somebody who was blogging. They were saying how wonderful this was going to be. It was going to be a great experiment, and they were really looking forward to it. And then they did it, and their expectations were completely changed by the end. And I saw this and thought, okay, this would be a good kind of negative side of it. But what she says is very interesting indeed. It is the end of the love affair, but she says this: as this new way of learning played out over time, my students found they didn't need me to locate or create videos for them. Instead, they learned how to learn, and they were able to find their own resources. For me, this was a much more important skill than following my directions or using resources I told them to use. And she goes on to say, I've learned that inquiry and PBL learning can be incredibly powerful in the hands of students, never teach in any other way again. When students own their learning, then deep, authentic, transformative things happen in the classroom. Nothing to do with videos or homework or latest finding education. It's everything to do with who owns the education. And this is what she finished, who owns the learning in your classroom. And I think it's a really good point, because I think what we want to encourage is not this passive assimilation of knowledge that we're giving to them, but actually encourage them to take ownership of their own learning. Another great example is from TED. They do these truly inspirational talks. They've got a huge bank of videos now. But what they've also done is produced this called TED Education site, which sits alongside it, and it allows you to take any of their videos, link in, well, add in other resources such as reflective questions, add links into other things, add discussion elements, and then package it together. And you can package it together so you've mashed up all of this content, and then you can present it to students as a flipped exercise that may come before one of your classes. So when you've got a piece where you've got to explore something that's maybe topical, or maybe sort of look into the future, or maybe just a particular news item, you found something on there, you can create something. Thinking beyond just the TED example itself, that this gives you a nice little summary of what a little flipped classroom exercise might be. A little bit of a stimuli trigger activity, followed by a few questions and a few resources. So it doesn't need to be a whole hour-long lecture. It doesn't need to be all of your slides just in a nice, neat format, and then you have to go away and just read through them. This idea is that they can create a little exercise that they will work through, a mini workbook. We also have expertise on campus. There was this project led by Tarsem Sinkuna. It involved Peter Ranger and myself and Danielle Hinton from Education. And it was called Designing for Inquiry-Based Blended Learning. What we did was try to get program teams, module teams together and get them to sort of think around how they're designing their learning exercises, particularly with a view to having this blended learning approach. And they work through sort of various different learning theories, one of which looks very similar to the what, so what, now what kind of thing, where you come in here with your design, you have a trigger event, it goes through discussion and a simulation evaluation, and you circle through each week perhaps. But the key elements in the middle are the cognitive presence, the teaching material, the teaching presence, so the facilitator, the guide on the side, and then the social presence where there's the communication happening between each, in order to create this nice blended learning but inquiry-led focus. And they did this through, one of the methods was this nice simple diagram just to allow you to think around, well, what am I doing with my class? You could do one of these for each week or each module and just start to summarise the structure of what you do. And Peter also created lots of little icons of all the different tools you could use, and you were allowed to then map it out and just sort of see visually how you would structure a blended learning, it was a flipped classroom sort of experience. Finally from me, there's also through Echo, you've heard of Echo through as a lecture capture system, but in it, obviously you're recording your lectures, which don't need to be live lectures, they can be offline lectures, but it also has within it sort of discussion boards, sort of chat areas, and for the tutors you can see all the analytics of who's accessed what and when, how many hits you've had in your slides. So they're sort of arguing that their tool is moving towards that sort of flipped classroom model, that you can have a resource which you can then discuss face-to-face later. Prem has actually taken that concept and applied it in his module this year. He's now going to talk a little bit further about it.
Thank you, John. Well, that's a great sort of background introduction. I can probably speak a bit more from a personal experience. I haven't got a marker pen on here, but I can't write anything. I'll just try and remember. So, why did I do it? I think John's covered a lot of things. I touch closely to what I believe's happened. So, I think, to use the phrase, probably a perfect storm happened in the last year for me. A combination of things. It starts off with a growing anxiety, disappointment really, with PowerPoint. Oh, thank you very much. No offence. It's just getting good. A disappointment with PowerPoint. Simply two reasons. One, I felt it was, and I've used it in all the ways you can imagine and so forth, but I felt the students became more passive, simply because they knew that they could get those notes off the web or print them out. They came along. But more importantly for me was, as a teacher, I wasn't engaged anymore with the teaching. I could literally pick up the stick out of my pocket like this, plug it into the computer, and I can give you that lecture now. I could just do it. Chris, any of us could do it, couldn't we? Just because I know what's coming up next. I could press the thing, see it and go. So that was a disappointment. I felt the passivity in the students was a driver for me. Another thing I was anxious about was the sense that following the lecture, because this is the thing I can take about the flip. When I first heard about flip, I thought we're already flipping. And those of you who teach on the module I lead on IRM, respiratory one, know that I give a lecture and then the following week there's a tutorial based around that lecture. That's in a sense flipping, in that they've got the material, they come to the thing to apply. What I felt, however, was one, the students hadn't done sometimes that much work towards preparing for the tutorial, so the sessions were often a reiteration for some students of the material that had already been given, so there wasn't new learning going on, there wasn't application. So in order to deal with that, and to deal with the students, one of their major complaints for the module was the variation between tutors in the small group sessions. So my tutor did this, my tutor didn't do this, but my friend's tutor did that better. That variation is part of their learning in a way. They have to understand how to deal with it. But in order to cope with that, I tried, and you just saw there on WebCT, I brought up a bunch of clinical case-based scenarios for the students to use, so there would be a bit more uniformity from my colleagues. So the 22M groups, we used to have 22 individual tutors doing that. We've now gone down to about 18, because some people are doing it twice. But 18 different people with different styles had to be accommodated. So I tried to use the scenario-based system, but before we could apply it, the staff, a number of staff emailed me to say they weren't confident or comfortable with the idea of having a bunch of questions that they hadn't really prepared for or have been trained to deal with. And so that sort of died a little bit. So that happened, so we've got a concern about students applying their knowledge. The third thing that has happened in this perfect storm, this combination, really was the advent of some of the new technologies that we've got. So they're not that new now. Echo 360 allowed podcasting. So I began podcasting 2 years ago, and I first podcast my whole series of lectures. They stayed up on the web, and then the following year I podcast all again, brand new, but because it was all PowerPoint, it was essentially the same talk again with a few little tweaks. So I've got the copy on the server of all my talks. So that was one thing. And the other thing was turning points. So clickers were available for the first time. And a year or so ago, all the year 1 and 2 medical students were given a clicker, so that I knew that when they came to the lecture, that was available. So those are really the combination of things that made me think about taking it on. And probably, and this is not a sort of an insignificant or even a flippant one, I felt I was confident enough and possibly even senior enough to fail. I felt comfortable with the fact that if I tried an experiment on flipping, I could fail and probably end up having to report to myself about how awful it had gone and be comfortable with the fact that I could then go out to people and say this did or didn't work in a way that perhaps somebody on probation who has been engaged with learning new ways of delivering might feel lacking in confidence in doing such a thing. And I'll give you my headline story. The students generally have been, I'll say, ambivalent. I'll give you some comments in a moment for them, but it has been difficult for some of our students. And again, without casting too many aspersions, I think doing it in the classroom at school may be fun and exciting, but we are inheriting here, and especially the medical school with medicine, dentistry, BMSI, and so forth, a lot of students who have grabbed high grades, some of whom have grabbed them through a style of learning that this does not suit. And therefore any attempt to move them from that style of learning that has suited them well is going to be met with resistance. And I think Claire and Wendy's now left, have come along to my flipped sessions and can give us some more advice. But we've seen quite a differential. Students who generally are quite didactic or wanting didactic approach just have disengaged with lots of the process. Those students who are more inquiring have loved all of it, and I think that's been the trick for me, really. So what does it look like? Let's have a look. I won't put this one up for the moment. Let's have a look. So you're all probably aware, let me just go down to the last slide here anyway, just as a matter of interest. So this might be a typical didactic PowerPoint lecture that I gave movement of gases. So I do that, blah, 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 blah. They've got it in there, they've got it in their notes. God knows what they write, it's all there, but they will write things. And then I give them some numbers and I try and do applications, so we're not memorizing 8.4 million or anything like that. We're talking all the time. And this gives rise to this, and then we go on to an application. It goes on, as you know, we've all got PowerPoint. So that's a typical PowerPoint slide that I might have had, and that would have gone on for 10 lectures or whatever it was. This is not in one go. Not in one go. Felt like it sometimes, but it wasn't. So, I thought, okay, this year I would set myself a task. So all I had was a PowerPoint on a stick. This is now what I would need for lecture 1. So that came from lecture 1. So I set up, I had to write, I wrote it in Word. So I now have, this was the notes I took into a lecture with me. These are the notes I took in. You don't need to read them. It's because it was the first time ever I had done this, and I had a lot of material to think about. Now, of course, I didn't read this out, but it was there as my little crutch. But you can imagine that was not easy to write. So every one of my lectures starts like this. What do I need to take in? A pot plant from my office. To remind myself, why do I want a pot plant? Because I start off talking about why do we breathe. And I remind them about the link between photosynthesis and respiration. I take a plant, we all thank the plant for the oxygen and so on and so forth, blah, 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 blah. But this is in a lecture with 400 students, so that was the other point I wanted to make. I wasn't flipping in a small classroom. This is with 400. I really want to take on that challenge, John, that all people have said is you can't flip 400, and I still don't think I've convinced myself that you can. That you can't flip 400 in a room the size of the Leonard Deacon. Currencies, because I'm talking about ATP, and how all the different foods got to be doing respiratory quotient. So in a way, I'm flipping in a way, my own way. I was giving examples applying. So in the lecture, I would have said ATP is, I wouldn't have said universal currency. I should have ATP is the basis of the energy, blah blah, and food, glucose, and oxygen comes in this way. But I would have just put three currencies. So I use the visualizer. Chris has been using a visualizer since whenever, or visualizer type things, overhead projectors and so forth. And every year, I know that Chris gets the best feedback scores from the students and wins Teacher of the Year every year. And it's probably partly style, partly because of the ease of renal physiology compared to but largely, I think, because the difference between seeing that thing I showed you, the alveoli being budded out from the trachea, versus a hand-drawn differential from a trachea onwards, where the students watching is massively, massively different in educational terms. I was actually peer observed during one of the sessions by a senior person, a clinician, who was in the audience, who came to the front. We had the discussion afterwards, and she said to me that it was really amazing to see a graph drawn out by hand again, as she had been when she'd seen it, because it makes such a difference. We're all used to going to conferences and talks and seeing, there it comes, here it comes, here it comes. Even if you have it come up on an animation, it still comes up in about a second. But there's a world of difference in the learning. And I think, Claire, probably you would notice that in the visualizer, I think, more than in the PowerPoint.
Prem, if I can just interrupt.
Yeah.
I mean, this session's made me realise that I've been doing a sort of Neanderthal version.
No, you don't need toy cars. You don't.
50,000 years, well, 40 anyway. And you know, having the resource of a textbook, my book to read beforehand, which I encourage you to read beforehand, means it can be a very interactive lecture, and that's what I think helps. So what Chris has the advantage, of course, is that they will trust that book, because you are the person that wrote the book. Almost everybody else has students with lots of different textbooks available to them, and they'll get bogged down by the fact that one book says it's 8.4 million alveoli and the other one will say 9 million. And it's which one's correct? Well, you know, it's 8.7 really, isn't it? I mean, you know, that's what's difficult, but you had this reference source. But I think we have been flipping, that's what I mean. I think we have been for years. So this isn't really flipping, this is saying, read the podcast first, or look at the podcast first, and they were doing that. They really were doing the podcast. I was anxious the first one. So the first clicker question is, have you looked at the podcast? And overwhelming, 90% have looked at the podcast. So not a problem, 1 hour. The feedback, again, there's no order to my talk, you can see here. The order, the feedback was that the podcasts are great. And I think Carl's left now, podcasts are great. Even if you don't flip, I would ask you to consider strongly podcasting and leaving it up. The variation in the student ability is such that just going through that slide there on a PowerPoint is not sufficient for all of them. And some of them want to go back. Sometimes they just miss a word. They miss a word and they ask the person next to them, what did he say? That person's now missed the next word, and it just goes around the group, and then they just lose interest. So what did I do with my flipping, as it were? What did you say about Joanne? Oh yeah, Joanne made me a paper cone. So we talk about how airflow, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. She showed me how to do it.
From the Guardian, then?
Well, that's the paper we had in the house. I wanted a newspaper. So it reminded me what it was. Yeah, it had to be Guardian newspaper. If I just said from Guardian, I might have thought it was someone's parent or whatever, you know, obviously. What that is just demonstrating to them how airflow is altered by the fact that you increase surface area. Now I can explain that in the lecture, but what we actually did is I got a student down from the audience to blow through a long tube, and we held a piece of cotton wool at the end, and you go, and you can see it just flaps away. So if you make a cone like that, like the respiratory system, and you blow as hard as you can, then nothing, that doesn't move at all. And in terms of visualness, they got that. But I wouldn't do that in a lecture that was not going to be giving, that was also reliant on using content, because I'd be anxious of the amount of time it was taking. So I knew they understood it, so I could take for granted that they understood it, that concept, because it's a simple equation. The speed is related to the surface area. They get the equation, but then to actually see it, visualize it, was better. So that would go down. Key points, yeah, this is for you for today. So I've asked them to do it, so bring your clickers, bring the handbook, don't expect to take notes. So I did give them an indication of what I wanted to do, and this is important as well. We had the discussion board, again John, you mentioned it in your talk. There was a point at which the students could have engaged with it. I've got over 250 interactions on the discussion board, but they're often post the tutorials, post all of the teaching. There's very little pre. So the people doing the podcast, I got very little leading up to. There's a couple, but it wasn't something that happened. Then I would start, there was a race, wasn't there? I got some students to run around the class, and everyone had to just observe. Now you could do that in a lecture, but I'd be worried in a lecture that I wasn't giving them the content. So in the lecture I would have told them that we breathe in order to bring in oxygen, get rid of CO2, but it's matched to our metabolism. So I just got 2 students to race around, 2 of the rugby boys who'd won that weekend, the rugby match, so it was easy to convince them to come down. They ran around, and then the class had to observe what was different about them before and after they'd run, and write it down. So you are interacting all the time. And they got the fact that they were breathing harder, they got the fact they were hotter, they got the fact that one of them was sweating. So that's just my notes, what am I doing, why am I doing it for? And then this is important on the visualizer. Now I don't give them all of that, those are just for me to trigger for me. This is me writing on the Sunday, basically before the Tuesday, what I want. This is just a proxy for me. In the end you don't end up reading it. And next year I'll take this is for me for next year, I'll just break it down to guides, because I was only doing it the night before really. Humans are good, better than car engines, all that kind of stuff. How much ATP, that's what the battery's for. There's too much notes. As I got better at this, my notes get less in the later modules. And then it was all about clickers. So having done all that, here's a clicker question. So the students have had the podcast, they've now had a demonstration, they've had the, I didn't really have to give them this equation before, that was in the podcast, but not in my teaching. So I give them this question, and I've written down for myself, just to remind myself, and the answers are poor, ask to confer. So I do that. They have a go, and of course, 40%, 50% get it right, many don't. So I just say, okay, got another minute, just do a re-poll on the turning point, talk to somebody next to you or in a group of 3, have another go, and always it goes up, the right answer, always. I never saw it go down, which was always good, because I didn't know what to do, it went down the wrong way. All I could say was that's really good. One thing I learned from doing Turning Point the year before on its own in a lecture was that I would see something like 60% of the students get it right, and I would say something like, that's brilliant, well done, that's exactly the right answer, and move on. Come the evaluation, why does he not tell me why I got it wrong? I am one of 40% of the group that deserve to be told why I was wrong. So now I always make a point of going through. So if I have an answer, these are all multiples of each other, I'll say to them, why I've chosen these as, if you like, ones that could be detractors for good reasons. And I will always give them the answer in a way. So even if you've got it right, I will just go through for the student who feels that they are being left out. So this applies that sort of differential between the weaker and the brighter. The brighter ones, I don't believe, mind a few seconds of their time being wasted, if you like, helping the others. Because they could also, in that interaction bit, do the teacher role, which I think they quite enjoy, convincing somebody that they're right. And then it just goes on about branching. Yeah, and so this was again, just interactions. The lung is obviously a large surface area, you get a lot more diffusion across that because of it. And I gave them an example, which you never would have done in a class. I basically said that I'd been out, because it had snowed that week, and I'd been out and I could only find one glove and a mitten, but I went out and made a snowman, and one of my hands got really cold. The other one was okay. Now put your hand up like that if you think it's the mitten, put it up like that if you think it was a glove, and it's just nice seeing about 400 students putting their hand up like that or that and work out what it is. So then I draw a mitten, that's a mitten. That's just to remind me of a mitten, missing a finger, a thumb. And then inside that I draw a glove. And then in a different colour I identify how much greater the surface area was, and therefore that the mitten was right. You give them lots of things, like if you didn't have a branching lung, you'd have to be 15 foot tall to have a lung do the same job. So I tell them, 15 foot's up there, so they get an idea. That's a 50-foot lung. I said, that's not me, that's my lung. So they get an idea, and then we go on and on with the visualizer. So really, it takes a lot. This is where the cars come down. You know when you're going down to your carriageway and they close one lane and you all slow up? It's because people slow down. What you should do is do twice the speed through the single lane and the flow will continue. So I tell them to speed up through a blockage and then say, I am joking. But, or am I? But, so there's a few little things. It's not really flipping in the sense of application at times, but then this is a very early one. So again, another turning point about gas molecules and partial pressures and so forth. But because it's the first lecture, there's very little application, clinical application at this point. There's still a lot of basic physics underlying this. With time, as we went through, they become more clinical examples. So, for instance, when I go on to do control of breathing, we spend 15 minutes on coning. Lots of x-rays, lots of pictures of people who've had cerebral vascular accidents and how the brainstem, how the breathing is affected. They never got that in the lectures. In the lecture they would have got that any damage to the medulla or the pons through stroke or hemorrhage or trauma or anything like that will lead to changes in breathing. Now we can spend 15 minutes on the application of it. So anyway, enough of all that. That's there. Let's go and see what we can if this works. I just dragged these down. Kevin watched me do this a minute ago. So at the end of the sessions, towards the end of the sessions, because we have tutorials every week as well with these, Claire and Wendy led on a questionnaire survey of the students, and we got almost half of them really, about 80, 90 responses. Chris, Lowe's group, everybody, and they asked very simple and few questions because the students get questionnaire to death, really. So this is the first one. The interactive lectures and practicals improve my understanding of some aspects of the module above and beyond the podcasts. And the number of positives, almost 60%, and then we're down to neutral and positives, outnumbering the negatives. But 20%, I always worry about that. That's the prodigal son in me. Where's the 20% coming from? How could it not improve? How could it not improve? I mean, it's just beyond belief, really. But I'll show you some of the questions later. The free text. Some people it doesn't improve. Detrimental, some people have said. Confusing. These are the cases I talked about, which is part of the flipping. So they've done the podcast. They now have a bunch of questions. Some of the questions are open-ended, so there is no real right answer. Many of them do have an answer, and the students just want the answer. Wendy isn't here, but she gave me a lovely anecdote. There's one of the questions which is a calculation, and the students asked for the answer, and she said, well, you should be able to do it. We could go through. No, I just want the answer. The answer's 7, she said. Which is what it was, I think, 7. And they just stare at her. So they don't want the answer. You actually want the help to get to the answer sometimes. So it's very difficult. But anyway, this one said they can use clinical scenarios. So again, anecdotally, I think that's all we've got really. So they use the SGTs to build on. Now again, I only have the anecdotal evidence really. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, we've lost 5 tutors from the IRM course. And the view I've felt in my group, and I'm biased, but I've talked to other people, is that this year the SGTs were far better. The students had come far better prepared. I don't know to what extent that was the interactive lecture or the fact that it was the podcast. I would put a lot of it on the podcast. I'd put a lot on the fact that instead of my standing in front of them going blah, blah, blah for an hour, and then they just took the notes and went away, came to the tutorial blanked, really, ready to get taught again. Because it's a podcast, it's a much more personal affair. They've had to find the time themselves, they've had to sit down and do it, and then identify how they would understand that material for the thing. So, Claire, would you agree the small groups that you find were better?
Yeah, they just came with a much higher level of sort of the knowledge which you could then apply to things. So I was covering things that I've never covered before in the tutorials because they had the stuff that you had to spend hours on before. Yeah,
we had a 2-hour session once for a very difficult stuff on mechanics. And it used to take the best part of the 2 hours. This year I did it in an hour. I don't know, the experience may be different from different people. Kevin,
I'd say they were more knowledgeable this year. I'd agree with that.
I mean, it's a funny thing because they're a very demanding crowd this year, I'll tell you that. They're higher
level questioning.
I just think that, absolutely, Teresa, I think the high level of questioning, the level, actually the range in the classroom, that one thing that we saw in that video was reduced, the variation was reduced. I actually felt comfortable to ask anybody a question now and be able to answer it. And I think if anything, they caught me on the hop by not being as prepared for them as they could be. And in fact, some of our feedback, this is good feedback, definitely. Oh, I haven't written down the questions, but was it useful or not? Yeah, the interactive lectures, helped me to understand the podcast. I love it the way it's been taught. It helps me understand theory rather than pattern. You know, obviously I choose the good ones as well, but there are some bad ones. False, I didn't agree. I attended some lectures which were slightly useful. These are the interactive ones, but didn't add much beyond what was on the podcast. So I often didn't attend lectures and felt my time was spent better doing other work. I mainly just watched the podcast, as I found it hard to stay concentrated in the lectures, as often we'd already learnt it once. So they asked for feedback, they asked for all these kind of things. So this idea that you've learnt it once is quite a novel one, really. Every student is now going to leave this week and go back and revise. They had a free revision session, 1 hour. You know, tutorials this was about. So the question, didn't go through all the questions. If you give them a question, it's essential to go through all of them. They feel, we didn't feel that was the case. Okay, so my experience, it's hard work. It's hard work. It's demoralising, incredibly demoralising. At the end of the lecture, I still got, do we need to know this? I gave them CT scans, MRIs of the brain that I wouldn't have given in a lecture. Can you put them up on the web? So I'm going to have an exam question that says, draw an MRI scan of a brain or something. And it's really weird. It was application of the fundamental concepts which are in the podcast. So it's demoralising. I actually feel that my evaluation may go down this year because some people may have felt that this was doubling up their time. Some students did say, you know, I've already had this hour, so I've done that 1 hour of lecture. I don't want 2 hours. Other students have enjoyed it. The number of students coming gradually fell through the 10 weeks, I felt. But I could correlate that fall very well against the increase in course assessments in other modules. And I can't do the control because I know that everybody was taking hits towards the end in attendance because there were a few major hand-ins. And I can't do the control, but you know, that's me saying it. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time because we were going to do something, but we haven't got a ton of time.
No, I mean maybe just have an opportunity for some questions for the next 5 minutes or so.
The activity we were going to do, if I hadn't talked as much as I have, was to ask everybody in groups of 2 or 3 to think of one element that you teach now that could be flipped, and what would you do and how would you do it. So I think that's a homework thing.
Yes.
That's a homework thing.
We haven't flipped, sadly.
And I think I agree with what I saw on one of your slides, John. You don't need to flip everything. I flipped all my lectures this year. I think some are just hardcore. I can do with explaining those as a lecture, and there are others where I can flip. But I haven't flipped entirely as theory does it, in the sense that it wasn't just application. But I got group work going. I got people to discuss things. I don't know if you can think of any other things that particularly worked well, Claire.
I mean, they really did engage with the things like the peer discussion and doing the click questions, even things like calculations. They didn't just sit there and then put any old answer.
Yeah, because you were sitting at the back watching, weren't you?
You can see them working through, you know, and you can, like the centre section are the most engaged, and then they sort of spread out from there. So it's quite interesting. I don't know whether it'd be the same in any other lectures. It'd be interesting to look to see where they place themselves as well. But I think, you know, in a way, with that differentiation, they tend to sit with the people that they get on with, and they're probably similar abilities and things, and you know, so they make the most out of.
But they were definitely doing it. When I asked them to do something,
they would definitely do it.
And it was silent, absolutely spookily quiet, where they were asked to do something. Whereas with the clickers, as you all know, there can be sometimes conversation because they clicked and then they talked to their friend. So that was very useful. But yeah, they are critical sometimes.
Yeah, I've never used the clickers in the lectures, but I've frequently, probably in every lecture, asked them to vote about what they think will happen about something. You know, what's going to happen to the sodium concentration in the efferent arteriole compared to the afferent, something like that. And you know, they've got the 3 possibilities: it can go up, it can go down, it can stay the same. And then they can see that there's a bunch of people who get the wrong answer, and why we need to spend more time on it. And that makes, I think, the ones who already know more tolerant of what you spend the time on in the lectures.
I think what's different here then, Chris, is that because of Echo 360, I've captured all that we've got the data, and then we can identify if it's still a problem, as opposed to try and rectify it live, where people, may not have engaged. And also the point about the clickers is it's anonymous as well, so that helps as well, doesn't it? And you use paper, don't you, sometimes, Teresa? Yeah, coloured card, which is a nice lo-fi way of doing it, if you like.
Is there any way we can make sure the students actually watch the podcast?
How?
Is there any way we can monitor student?
Do we need to, though, do you think, Tony? Do we need to? I think they're able to do it. I worried. So the first two lectures I took the count, and it was always high.
On CD-ROM systems, which I used to use, they had little kind of questionnaires. You can't proceed unless you've gone through the questions.
That's right.
And so you can ensure then that they've actually gone through the lecture before they come to your interactive.
Yeah. I'm confident that the assessment we've got coming up will test that. And some of the students, I haven't put all the things down, some where they've said, I'd rather spend the time learning myself. That's their choice, really. We don't take attendance.
A large fraction will just turn up, they wouldn't have seen it.
Yes, I know, but we don't have attendance registers in lectures, so I'm not so concerned. There will be people turn up, I think, who didn't look at the podcast, but then they wouldn't have got as much out of it, that's for sure. Teresa, and then back to Claire.
I think the feedback on the SGTs might be interesting, because I never got a sense that anybody in the SGTs was thinking, well, this is the third time I've heard this.
Yes, and that's why I use the scenarios, which are completely different.
It's interesting that if they've got a different person in front of them, they don't see it as having the same thing again.
Yes, that's true. Because it's me speaking on the podcast and on the thing. Yeah, good point.
So whether some of the interactive, whether if there was a different teacher in that session, whether
good point.
That would make a difference.
Not only for the student, but certainly for the person teaching. It's hard to say. You give your best
trying to say the best
anecdote. There's only so many jokes you've got.
You could consider that.
Yeah, I will do.
That middle session,
different person. Good point. Aware of time. There was a question over here. No, Claire, sorry. Claire.
I was just going to say I didn't really notice in the tutorials that there were people who clearly hadn't seen anything. No. So I think they'd at least done something. So there wasn't anyone that just had not got a clue.
Yeah.
I think if you get a lot of the clicker questions wrong, you'd think, I need to go back to this.
Well, they're quite competitive.
You learn iteratively.
There's a lot of peer pressure to...
Yes, they are. Yeah. They are. The clicker questions are useful, but you can use clicker questions in a standard didactic lecture very well as well. So this is slightly different. So the bottom line for me, okay, difficult. I'm going to end with, I did enjoy it. So the question I think I started with my disillusionment with PowerPoint. I felt really on the edge again all the way through this lecture, and that may be good or bad for people, but I quite enjoyed that hour of being pressurised and anxious. I did have points of departure on some clickers, so if they went one way with their answer, I would have to shift another way with my direction of the lecture, and that's quite weird against the PowerPoint linearity. Even in the in the old-fashioned PowerPoint, I've got PowerPoint and I've got a turning point. If they get it wrong, I go that way.
That's experience. That's how.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I was willing to do that.
To be able to just wing it.
One small anecdote. One of the blood gas one, I got a co-oximeter to show my oxygen saturation live on the visualizer. They could see 98, hopefully, %. And I put it on because I was worried about everything and talking and drawing and all that kind of stuff. It didn't come straight away because it doesn't. It needs time to just set off. So I was fiddling around with it, getting going. I put it on, my heart rate was 128, 138 heart rate. You could see it there written. And of course on the outside, I'm hopeful, it's quite a calm look. And so you suddenly realise as someone who teaches quite a bit in here, we must be pretty edged all the day long. What kind of things happen to our cardiovascular system, I don't know. So up the front, there's some research for it. But it was impressively high. And it probably wasn't higher there than much of that whole of that lecture. So I felt that, whereas I think with the PowerPoint one, it'd probably be down in the 40s. The lights are down, blah, 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 and I would just go with them downwards.